I remember one day, it was when the High Commissioner was away.
Yeah.
And so I think I'd come back from a meeting with one of the ministers, and we had a trade mission coming in. So my commercial officer was doing that. And we had a consular case. So my vice consul was dealing with that. And somebody had got malaria, and I was doing an internal investigation into some financial oddness. And I think we had an audit going on, and my security manager just walked over to me and said, "Jenny, I need to talk to you about importing a cat."
Welcome back to How to Diplomat. I'm Jen Upton. That's the reality and the occasional absurdity of diplomacy. One minute you're negotiating with ministers or handling a tragic consular case. The next you're sorting out customs clearance for a cat. My guest today, Jenny Wilcox, spent her career in the private offices of some of the most powerful people in the Foreign Office, and as Deputy Ambassador in some of the toughest postings overseas. We talk about how to adapt to different cultures to get the best results, the impact crises can have on your team, how to manage powerful personalities, and what it's like to be the only woman, often the most junior person in a male-dominated room. We also swap stories about how to tell when your principal is fading and maybe on the verge of hangriness, and share our most successful tricks to get them back on track. Stay with us, you're about to hear what diplomacy really looks like behind closed doors. Hi Jenny. So I was just reflecting how we know each other. We were in the Foreign Office at the same time.
Yeah,
Specifically, you were in the Foreign Secretary's private office. At the same time, I was in political director's office,
Yes.
right? Our names are very similar. We used to get each other's emails. Looking at your amazing career, quite a lot of your roles were in private office, either ministers' private offices or very senior officials' offices. And I suppose even your Deputy Ambassador, Deputy High Commission role
Very similar.
is quite similar. Yeah, what was it that kind of drew you to those roles?
So I don't know if I was necessarily drawn to them, but I got my job in the Foreign Secretary's office very early on, and I was drawn to it because it sounded cool. Assistant Private Secretary to the Foreign Secretary. It sounds cool. It's in the big mysterious office at the end of the corridor that usually has the doors closed, and people always look scared when they go in and when they come out.
And you're always told that you can't make any noise going past that office.
Yeah.
No chatting, no running,
It was all
no nothing.
a very bit hallowed, and so
there is about 3 or 4 doors to get into that particular private office. I mean, it is literally the entire wing of one part of the building. And I remember being sent up there with, the submission in hard form and never really knowing.
Yeah.
I mean, a huge amount of anxiety because I didn't know what door to go in.
Yeah.
And you sort of edge your way in, you kind of sidle in, and there's about 5 people in the first outer office, and they're all looking at you like, "What are you doing here?" And you're like, "Ah!" It's absolutely terrifying.
It really, really is. And sometimes you just sort of put it down on the table and hope it gets where it's going. And sometimes you sort of are allowed to pass through the outer door. Slightly more senior, serious-looking people and looking slightly more harried, and you're allowed to give it to one of them.
I seem to remember it was always slightly darker in there, slightly shady. And there's those wonderful evocative desk lamps, with the green glass.
In his office, or his office as well.
In the private secretary's sanctum.
Yes, a little bit,
Yeah. So we've probably fast forwarded a bit. We probably ought to explain what a private office does.
Yes. So private office, it's the sort of the hub that all the papers go through before they get to a ministerial decision. So if you're working in a department or a team and you want the minister to go somewhere or say something or have a meeting or take a decision, then someone will deal with it before it gets there. And there are usually assistant private secretaries that process it and focus on some particular issues, and then private secretaries that divvy up the rest of the world or the rest of the policy space between them. And their role is to look through everything before it gets to the minister, make sure it's legible and understandable, make sure that the minister can deal with it in as quick a way as possible, and make sure that all the information that the minister needs to take a decision or anything is in something in as easy to digest and obvious way as possible. And then, get them where they need to go, or send it back and get your department to do it again.
That was always quite challenging. Yeah, I think that was always challenging. There was a huge amount of, I suppose, interpretation and translation and representation, so very often you as the assistant private secretary, the private secretary, was going into bat for the department that was seeking a policy decision, right? And so you had kind of spent a long time building those relationships. It's like diplomacy, isn't it? You spend a lot of time building the relationships so that when you have to ask the hard stuff or deliver the hard messages, you've already got a good positive relationship. So you would go in and sort of represent their best interests in the office with the minister or the principal, and then have to do the opposite when you're delivering the message.
Exactly. It's being that conduit both ways.
Yeah. What did you learn managing all of those powerful personalities?
Worked for a number of very different personalities who were powerful in their own ways.
Yes.
And for the most part, it was about knowing what's going to work and what doesn't, and how to communicate that in both directions, knowing when to get the most out of them or how to get the most out of them, building the relationships with your departments or the departments that are working to the ministers, as you say. Humanising the ministers or the senior officials is a really important part of it, because actually, as we've said, you're behind those big doors. The people that are sending up the policy decisions are not going to get much face time with the person that's actually taking the decision. So they might not realise that if you are, I don't know, asking for a really urgent answer at 8:30 in the morning, then whoever it's going to might, not have had a cup of coffee, or might have 17 different things on their table, or might, any number of things. And being able to explain that and say, if you phrase this way, or if you give me a few hours with this, then I'll be able to give it to them at a much better time. Or a lot of what it is really, really small things that sound potentially insignificant but actually make all the difference.
Yeah, every time you would have a new minister, the private secretary, a good one, would come and speak to each of their departments and say, this is what the minister likes. This is how they like to see information, whether it's email or, update or whatever. Yeah. But I remember one saying, just because the deadline is 5 o'clock, does not mean that you send it at 5 o'clock.
No.
Because if you send it at 5, that means the poor private secretary has to stay for a couple of hours after that to get it in. So, please don't just assume that's the deadline. And you can bring it in earlier. It would make our lives an awful lot easier. We were less tired, less fractious, and you might actually get a better outcome if you think about that thing a little bit more carefully. That was quite another funny story I've got, and I won't tell you which overseas posting it was, but the private secretary who accompanied the minister would always have her handbag or her bag full of fun size chocolate, like Mars bars, because she at one point during the day, the minister in question would have a massive sugar crash, and the private secretary needed to keep the minister, going, and so knew that she could.
I had so many of those little things. If I could see my minister doodling during a meeting or anything, I knew that that's when I make a coffee. They would normally drink tea, but if they're doodling during a meeting, then I'll just...
They needed an infusion.
A coffee, please. And that was required. But it's knowing their preferences.
I know. I remember working with visits officers at post, and obviously in most cases, most embassies, high commissions are really keen for the minister to come out, or the the senior official to come out, and that they get the best value from the experience. So they would often completely pack the
Yeah,
schedule with meeting after
absolutely.
meeting after engagement.
Mhm.
And you would often say, we need to build in like comfort break time. At some point with all that coffee, they're going to have a break. And they're also going to have, we call it box time. So that a time when all of their correspondence gets going to have to kind of keep up with what's going on in
Yeah,
London as well.
absolutely. I got numerous visit programs that, seem to be lacking in food and no showers or gaps between meetings and dinners, explaining the obvious, really. And then, learning when to do that in advance so that you sort of cut down your working time as well.
Yeah.
As I went on in any of those roles, I think I learnt that even though it seems like a small thing, knowing where you add value helps you retain some of that power, even when you're talking to very, very senior people who just think you're there to process stuff, or who may just think you're there to process stuff. Knowing that, well, yes, in a certain way I am, but I know when to process it, and it's your things that I need to process. So let's carry on like that.
So how did that evolve? That feels a very ambiguous question. What was the sort of epiphany moment when you realised how you could convert that kind of perception into like a person of influence, I suppose?
So I think it was well, a couple of different times, I suppose, or a couple of different situations. Realizing in one job, I covered quite a broad geographical area, so I covered about 28 countries for one minister, and so that meant that 28 countries worth of decisions, meetings, everything would go through me on the way to the minister. Everyone thought that their thing was most important.
Yes.
Everything was really urgent. Just sort of bit by bit, realizing how to say thank you. I know it's really important. I know this is your top priority. If I can just let you know that these other things are also on the minister's plate, and these are how they connect to each other. And so I can let you know that if I share this at this time, it's got the most likelihood of getting you what you want. And so just bit by bit being reliable at being the person they need to get what they want. And then sort of playing that forward, and rather than doing it in the office, getting out and about among the teams before they even start to send things up, and say, what do you need to get out of the minister in the next couple of weeks? Okay, if you need to do that, then this is what it should look like. This is how you could frame it. This is when he's got a free day, or a freer day. So that's got the most likelihood of working. These are the other things that are on his plate. So think about showing that your decision relates to this other thing.
Yeah, I agree. I often found that the most effective and impactful private secretaries were the ones who were very visible in that way. And would spend quite a lot of time in their client departments, for want of a better word, and both understanding the battle rhythm, again, for want of a better word, in the department, and knowing what was coming up and, what was going to be appearing on their desk a couple of days later, and then vice versa, kind of explaining and building that picture of what else the minister is having to deal with.
I had a trick for doing that in my Europe days, actually. I would go out and just walk around the department and chat to people and figure out what was on their plate. And I discovered that a bag of mini stroopwafels from Tesco would get me all the way around the department in about an hour. And everyone would get one. I would get loads of useful tidbits of information and learn what was going on with people, learn what was coming my way, coming the minister's way. And then I was able to plan. It helped humanise the minister's office and me in a way. I wasn't always going to be this sort of slightly stressed woman looking up from a screen going, what have you got for me now? It sort of made us and me approachable. And also people knowing that means when you really put your foot down,
you mean it.
You're serious about it.
Yeah. And there's a good reason why you're not just sort of just being an obnoxious private secretary just because you can.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really important. How long were you in London before you went overseas, roughly?
2.5 years.
Oh, gosh, okay.
There was advertised a quite short notice. We want someone ASAP job in Burundi. which didn't actually have an embassy or a high commission. And it had a small liaison office attached to the British embassy, as was in Rwanda. And they wanted a political secretary to work there, base themselves in Rwanda, but spend at least half the time in Burundi, doing political reporting. It was well, political officer, the role of third secretary political, but then you sort of call yourself whatever you need to call yourself to get in the room and talk to people, really. Third secretary sometimes sounds a little bit too junior. So if you're a political officer or a political secretary, then that's a bit...
Yeah.
And Burundi was just coming out of civil war. It was an interesting place to find my feet. The head of DFID at the time had previously been a Foreign Office ambassador elsewhere in the region. So there was someone to sort of hold my hand and keep an eye on me. And I would go back to Rwanda on a regular basis.
It's amazing. What surprised you most when you went from London to Burundi? You know, your overseas postings.
Surprised me most? I think for me, and this is probably true for any of them actually, and I went to a variety of different places. So after Burundi, I was in Japan and then back to East Africa to Rwanda and then to Canada. But for any of them, I didn't feel nearly as much culture shock as I expected to. But I think for me, it was more that you sort of prepare or over-prepare to be wowed and to be surprised and to be a bit scared by it all. And so when you get there, it's kind of, oh no, this is okay. I can do this. This is all right. And people are nice. And I have a support network. And there are lots of people here in the same position as me. And people want to know who I am. And by and large, they want to help me out. So I always felt very welcomed and looked after where I went. So yeah.
Did you find the skills that you used or your approach changed depending on which country you went to?
A little bit, yes. It was perhaps a bit more or less around how much time you need to spend to build up a relationship before you ask for what you want.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And it felt like you needed to do more of that in Japan.
Yeah.
Both in terms of with the individuals or with your regular contact and just getting to know each other. But then also just in terms of how many times you would need to go back on a particular issue before you had a better sense of whether or not you were gaining any traction. You would sort of feel like you would go into a meeting and you'd download all your information, you'd say what you'd been asked to say and deliver the message you're asked to deliver. And then someone would say, well, thank you, we'll think about it. And you'd leave thinking, well, that's a no. Whereas in the East African postings, it seemed to be a little bit more, you sort of build the relationships, or I would build the relationships outside of that work so that actually when I went in for meetings, it was easier to get straight to the point.
I had two very different roles in Pakistan and in Egypt. In Pakistan, it was almost pure media, strategic comms. But in Egypt, it was political reporting. So I was needing to go out to talk to people and get information. And I can't tell you how stressed initially I would get about, right, okay, how am I going to get this person to give me the information that I need? And trying to think of all sorts of weird and wonderful techniques that I could extract this information. And then I would go and people would freely give you information. I couldn't believe it. I was like, why are you openly giving me the information I want without... And I remember many years later reading, I don't know if you've read this, it's called The Culture Map.
No.
By a woman who is a culture coach. And she talks exactly to that point. You know, in Asia, there's a different way of building relationships, productive, effective relationships and getting decisions made than there is, say, in Africa or in the US, for example.
Yeah.
So you were Deputy High Commissioner in Rwanda, right? I always thought the Deputy Ambassador role was the hardest role in the embassy because your day job is keeping the embassy going, you know, keeping it running operationally and not getting the ambassador's hair and the kind of political work that they were doing. And yet, when the ambassador went on holiday or left the embassy, the poor deputy ambassador would have to kind of step in and do a completely different job for a couple of weeks. Does that resonate with you, or does it? Was there different challenges?
It does. I mean, you're right, particularly where I was In Rwanda, there were 3 UK-based staff in our High Commission. Everything that London sent over would come to me to be distributed or dealt with, and everything that the local staff needed would come to me to be dealt with, and everything the ambassador or the High Commissioner wanted to hand over would come to me to be, and it just would all then sit with me until I figured out what to do
with it.
And it was everything. I remember one day, actually it was when the High Commissioner was away. I'd come back from a meeting with one of the ministers, and we had a trade mission coming in. So my commercial officer was doing that, and we had a consular case. So my vice consul was dealing with that, and somebody had got malaria, and I was doing an internal investigation into some financial oddness. And I think we had an audit going on, and my security manager just walked over to me and said, "Jenny, I need to talk to you about importing a cat." And I just had a moment where I stopped and then burst into maniacal laughter. But it's just everything. I think my favourite story like that, just digress, was a colleague who was deputy ambassador in Madrid. And it was lovely hearing this story and knowing that wherever you are, however big and important and close the country you're working in, is you as a deputy, you have exactly the same issues. So this guy had been filling in, and he'd come back from seeing the King of Spain. And he got back, as you do, and he got back to his desk, and there were 2 toilet rolls on his desk with a note saying, "Which one of these do we pick for the residents?" And I just thought, yeah, that's it. That's exactly it.
It's just the mental and cognitive challenges, I would imagine. Did it keep your feet on the ground, Jenny?
It really did, because you do realise those things are really important to people. And even if it is not meeting the King or dealing with a Brit in prison, to somebody, it's a really important thing. And that's where I think those 2 sorts of jobs, like the private office jobs, but also the deputy head of mission jobs, are similar. It's dealing with lots of different things all at the same time, keeping the plate spinning.
I don't know if you were ever in crisis as in overseas, because there's the additional challenge of that as well. Maybe you could talk through what your role is in a crisis as the deputy.
Yeah, so not in Rwanda, I wasn't. So not as deputy, although we did have some quite serious consular cases when I was deputy that, just by the nature of the things and the size of the office, meant that a lot of resource had to go into them, because whatever else is going on, if someone is desperately ill, or if someone has been arrested, or if someone has gone missing, then that's the most important thing. If there is somebody's safety or security or life on the line, then you need to deal with that. But in terms of crisis mode for a mission, I wasn't in that in Rwanda. But when I was in Tokyo, we had the 11th of March earthquake, tsunami, Fukushima disaster. And actually at the time when it happened, I was on leave. So I got in touch with my line manager at the time and said, "Do you need me to change my flights?" And they said, "No, we're going to be exhausted by the time you get back. So having a fresh pair of eyes will be great." So when I went back, it was at the time very much about, I was focusing on gathering information, make sure we knew as much as we possibly could, so that we could regularly contribute to, briefing to ministers, so we could figure out what we needed to get up to the affected areas, trying to find all the Brits that we needed to find and get them wherever they need to be, whether it was out of Japan or back to Tokyo or whatever. Dealing with media queries. Huge amounts of stuff. And at the time we were, working shifts 24/7. Something that really it really brought us together as a mission, actually. Crises, wherever they are, whatever sort they are, you have to work together and communicate really well. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And that comes out in team morale. It comes out in how you face the public, everything.
Yeah, I have had experiences at post, both in Pakistan and in Egypt, of significant crisis, where there's fatalities and things involved as well, which adds an additional layer of trauma, I suppose. I can't really think of any other way to describe it. I really noticed, you're right, the team really comes together, you know, because in a big post, you've got this normal operating condition, this slight rivalry. Rivalry is not quite the right word, but it's very similar to working in an office where, you know, accounts and HR and, you know, they've got their own way of doing things, and there can be a little bit of scratchiness.
Yeah.
But all of that breaks down when you're in crisis, because actually very often your roles change. You have a very specific, if you're a good crisis prepared post, you've got specific roles that are related to the crisis, whether that's log keeping or media handling or others. And I'd be interested in this because I notice, as you say, relationships worked really well in crisis. You come together. But I noticed afterwards something happens to the natural boundaries of professionalism by necessity break because of what you're going through. But it's really hard to step back from that again. I found relationships broke down much, much quicker after a crisis. People got a bit more ratty with each other, and their capacity to just be professional and deal with it was much shorter.
Yeah, maybe you're right. Thinking of Tokyo, but also actually in London, things that I really noticed about working in crises that, for want of a better phrase, make it a successful crisis. But it's when at the start of each shift or each rotation, you have someone at the beginning, and that's usually like the silver or whatever, saying, right, these are our objectives for the session. This is what we have to do. We have to do this briefing at this time. This is what we're doing overall. We are evacuating these people, or we are providing support here, or we're delivering this, or whatever it is. And there's the checking in to make sure that you are hydrated and fed and taking breaks and all those sorts of things. And all those sorts of things really matter in a crisis, to make sure that your staff are looked after. So when they work, or when you come out of them feeling well afterwards, it's because you've been looked after, you feel like you've contributed, you've known at every step of the way what you're trying to achieve and what your part in achieving that is. And then you come out of it feeling good. And in a place like Tokyo, we were doing, round the clock shifts, and we converted the sort of bar-y conference area into a canteen, and the residents' caterers were doing food around the clock as well. So at any time of the day or night, you'd walk into the bar and there would be, I don't know, the deputy ambassador and one of the gardeners and someone from accounts just sitting around having whatever food was left over. And those things, maybe they meant that people sort of didn't have their facades on afterwards. But I think there was a bit more understanding around that.
Yeah, well, that's good. That was a positive experience. Actually, you remind me. So in Cairo, I had just had a baby. He was 6 weeks old, and Arab Spring kicked off, revolution. They called us up and said, we're going to evacuate you. And obviously he had no passport, no travel documents. So we went to the airport and they wouldn't let us fly. Came back and we stayed overnight in the residence on the floor. And exactly as you say, in the kind of, it's very elegant dining room in the residence, but you had all sorts. And basically the catering staff, the residence staff, had raided what was left food-wise in the kitchen. We were so lucky and privileged in desperate circumstances. You had all sorts of people sitting around this table, cooing over the baby, eating before they had to go back to, do their nighttime shift in trying to find British nationals and evacuate them and, feed the briefing machine back to London. So quite a lot of your roles, correct me if I'm wrong, have been in quite traditionally male-dominated spaces. People ask me, because I was the same, I feel like I was maybe drawn to it, I don't know, or just it was more by accident than design. And people often ask me, like, how did you survive, thrive? Like, what would you advise? What recommendation or advice would you give to young women who are working in that kind of space?
So I did. I mean, I worked exclusively to male ministers or senior officials. For the most part, I worked to male ambassadors. There is still something about just recognizing your value, and that even if you are a woman who is 4 or 5 pay grades junior than the very important man walking in to see the minister, they still have to go through you, and you know what is on the minister's mind and what they're thinking about and what they need to do. You can have information to give. You have knowledge. and you have access. I was very lucky in that I was still working for the most part to very kind, considerate and intelligent male principals or line managers who absolutely knew my importance and my worth. And if somebody else wasn't seeing it, then they would emphasize it. I remember times when I was sitting there in a minister's office looking after my 28 countries, and senior male leaders or ambassadors sometimes would walk in or call and go directly to my male boss without really speaking to me at all. And my line manager would say, thanks, but you need to be talking to Jenny here, or I'll get Jenny to call you back. Or they would ask something of the minister and he would look at me and say, well, Jenny, I would start a lot of my days kind of chairing a meeting. So people who were at the time 3 or 4 grades above me, all of whom very much wanted to know, what was on my boss's plate for the day, what his priorities were. They all wanted to let me know what they needed him to do, and when they needed him to do it. They were sort of a little, I know, not starved for information, but yeah, I had stuff that they needed. And I didn't ever use that in any underhand ways, but to just recognise it and go, well, okay, if ever you feel like you're not entirely valued, just, recognise this. And something actually that one of my best ever line manager told me was just when you have moments like that, when you either realise what influence you have or what value you add, or when you feel like you're not doing it and you're being maligned, just remember how it feels. Just make a note of it, or think about, okay, well, how does this feel and how am I going to deal with it? Or what have I done well here? How have I been useful here? And that really sort of helped ground me in those rooms.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. I try to think what I did. I think I rarely confronted face to face bad behavior, actually.
Yeah.
Or, well, publicly. I rarely called out bad behavior to the person around other people. I think I defaulted to building that support network and those relationships around, around the stakeholders. So that as the most junior person and the only female in the room, I had done enough prep work with my stakeholders that if they saw the bad behaviour that their peer was subjecting me to, they took responsibility. A bit like your support network with your boss and your minister. You often do the influencing prior to prior to the behaviour.
And I think I did. I suppose it's similar to what I was saying about, if you've built that relationship that is friendly and approachable and based on mutual understanding, then when you say that you need something or something has to be a certain way, people go, okay, then, because they know you're serious.
Yeah.
It is also like if you're potentially the most junior woman in the room, people think, well, you're very quiet at a table. And I was conscious of that a lot when I was in Japan. And I discussed it with our ambassador at the time. And I said, I feel like, I don't really say that much at the table. And one of the other people in the group said, well, yes, but when you say something, that means I know that you mean it and you've thought about it. And it's probably an important thing that I have to listen to. The ambassador was less polite about it. He said, well, that means you don't have the bullshit gene, which I really liked. But then also similarly, I have on occasion, pulled it out to a principal or to a senior.
Yeah.
And, he knew I meant it. And admittedly, that was in frustration at the time. But I, in a very considered way, said, this is what is on my mind. This is what I've noticed. I do not think this is right. This is how it is affecting other people. And the person that I raised this with sort of stopped and had a moment and thought, yes, okay, I need to change something here.
Yeah, so I don't mean not address it at all. I just mean sometimes in terms of face saving, doing it in front of everybody isn't the great. I had a similar case, although I wasn't as controlled as you were. I had been pushed to my limit and I was crying and I basically marched into this person's office crying, trying to articulate. But I think this person saw, I'm not that person, saw what an impact their cumulative behaviour had over many, many months.
Yeah.
and basically said, "Do you want to talk about it now?" And I said, "No, I need to kind of, I've now got it out there,
Yeah.
but I would welcome a meeting later on." And actually, our relationship completely changed.
Mhm.
And this person admitted that it was a pattern of behaviour that
Yeah.
their spouse had called out as well, and that they knew they
Wow.
were doing it. And I was like, good grief, you know what?
Yeah.
Like, anyway, it was
Mhm.
better for having done it. So I don't mean not calling it out at
No,
all.
no.
I just sometimes open confrontation publicly is perhaps not always the best.
And they appreciate that as well. You're more likely to get it's the bigger diplomatic principle of the critical friend, isn't it? If you take
Exactly
something
so.
into a quiet space and don't criticize in public, let people know, well, I've clocked this and it's not great.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm watching you. So you're not in the Foreign Office anymore.
I'm
You
not.
are out in the wild.
Yeah.
What diplomatic skills have you brought to the...
I'm not afraid to be the person who asks the stupid question, because no questions are stupid. And I think this came a lot from proofing and passing and reading so much stuff that was going to go to a minister that had to be done in 2 or 3 sides of A4 to get them to take a really difficult decision. And so if I'm reading that and there's something I don't understand, then I'm a fairly intelligent person, so somebody else probably isn't going to understand it either. And so I'll ask the question so somebody else doesn't have to. Or if you're sitting around the table and somebody's talking and you're thinking, I don't know what you mean, then not being afraid to say it.
There's a confidence there, though, isn't? I mean, I agree. Curiosity is a constant theme across this the whole podcast. Everyone I've spoken to and I've talked to, like, what's the core thing or the core skill that has helped you adapt and thrive, both in and outside of diplomacy, is always curiosity. Like, really trying to understand what's going on, understand the person in front of you, understand their world, and try and work out how you can meet them where
Yeah. And I think I've got a couple of examples, if I may, which come to mind. So when I was in Tokyo, a relatively new ambassador, I must have been there for a couple of years at this point. We had a new ambassador. He'd been there for maybe 3 or 4 months. And there'd been an earthquake. Not a big, serious one, but big enough to get us out of our buildings and congregating somewhere with hard hats on. We were all there, and the ambassador turned to our corporate services manager at the time and just went, "What do I do?" And for me, that was brilliant. We all knew that our corporate services manager was absolutely the woman who had all the information. And so for him, in front of everyone, to just go exactly to the right person and say, "Lauren, what do I do?" was just brilliant.
Do you know, I have got a similar story. It's just popped into my mind. In Egypt, we had obviously 2 revolutions. It was a big tourist post, so we had countless crises, consular crises. And I remember we were coming out of one, sadly, where there was fatalities. And just as we were doing the wash up for that, the new DHM was kind of hosting the wash up. And then word came in that there was a new consular crisis that we're going to have to deal with. And this was the first one he was going to lead as the kind of crisis silver, whatever it was. And we were all battle tested and having done 3 or 4 years of these, like weekly. So we all just instinctively knew what to do. And he was new, he'd never really done it before. I think it was the first time he was a DHM, Deputy Ambassador. And he brought out, I was staggered, he brought out a little aid memoir that all new Deputy Ambassadors get. So consular team in London give them consular training. And then give them a little, it was like a credit card sized aid memoir about what to do, what their role should be in a crisis, and the key questions to ask. And he whipped it out and he said, and he went through it. And like you, I was absolutely flabbergasted. I was like, this is someone I will follow into the flames as a leader, because they're humble and, self-aware enough to know when they don't have the expertise in the room, and will, cleave to those who do.
I will just add that it's not a curiosity example, but the same ambassador, and I mean, this was one of the best and most sort of heartwarming examples of leadership that I ever had. I was there, and a family member was very ill, my grandma, who had brought me up, and My line manager was on leave and the deputy ambassador was on leave. So there was sort of not really a layer of anything between me and the ambassador. And I went to see him and I said, I need to talk to you about my grandma and he just cut me off. He said, you go.
Oh.
He just said, if you need to go, you go. We'll manage. And yeah, exactly like you say, I would have
I can see the impact still after all these years. Amazing, Jenny. I enjoyed that. I feel like we could have gossiped for another hour at least, but I think we're going to have to leave it there. If there's one diplomatic skill you could give to every 16-year-old in the world, what do you think that would be?
I think it's the confidence to ask questions you're not sure about. Yeah.
That's beautiful. All right. I think we'll leave it there then. Thanks ever so much for appearing.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Pleasure. What I loved about that conversation with Jenny is how it shows the real texture of diplomacy. Yeah, of course, there are grand negotiations and ministerial meetings and VIP visits, but the job is more often defined by the small things. Knowing when your boss needs coffee before they do, or building trust amongst your colleagues by showing up with cookies. It reminded me of a piece of advice my very first boss gave me when I first joined the Foreign Office. Keep a diary or a folder of the kind words, thanks and positives people send your way. On the tough days, and there will be tough days, that's what will remind you that the small things that you do matter. These aren't just diplomatic tricks, they're lessons for anyone leading a team, running a project, or just trying to influence without the authoritative job title of leader or manager or boss. The small things are what make the big outcomes possible. We also talked about what it means to be the only woman and often the most junior person in a male-dominated space. Jenny's reminder to recognise your value, to hold your ground and to choose when and how to speak. Those are skills that anyone who's ever felt overlooked can use. You don't have to be the one dominating the room to have impact. Sometimes, actually, it's quite the opposite. And finally, Jenny's story is a reminder to keep perspective, to laugh at the absurdity, to be self-deprecating, to know that asking for help is a strength, not a weakness. The diplomats we spoke about and the ones that we respected the most are those that stayed humble, whether they were managing a crisis or figuring out how to import a cat, or choose toilet paper for the ambassador's residence. Thank you so much for listening. If you've got questions about diplomacy, leadership, or just the absurd side of life behind the scenes, send them my way at jennifer@howtodiplomat.com. I'll be answering listener questions in future episodes, so I'd love to hear from you.